What if the greatest threat to humanity was not a weapon, not a king, not even a demon? What if it was knowledge, ancient, divine, and forbidden? A knowledge so powerful that it changed the course of creation itself. Not because it was false, but because it was true. Truth so raw, so holy, so dangerous, that God himself drew a line in the heavens and said, "This shall not be crossed." But someone crossed it. They were not devils, not yet. They were angels, watchers, assigned not to rule, but to witness, to stand at the edge of the world and observe. But they did more than observe. They descended, not as invaders, but as seducers. Cloaked in light-speaking secrets never meant for human ears, they gave us gifts wrapped in gold but lined with poison. Metal, enchantment, war, divination. And for a moment, mankind felt divine. But heaven did not rejoice. Heaven wept. Why did God forbid this knowledge? What was it about these teachings that could birth giants, shatter nations, and summon a flood to wipe the earth clean? And why does it still matter today? Because the story was not buried. It was written, preserved, hidden in a book that was once read beside Isaiah and Genesis, then cast out and called dangerous. That book is the Book of Enoch, and it tells a story most of the world was never meant to hear. In today's journey, we open that book. We follow the watchers from their first descent to their final chains. We uncover what they taught, what it cost, and why their influence still lingers in our world. This is not just a tale of angels. It is a mirror for mankind, a warning, and perhaps a second chance. Let us begin with the ones who watched too long and fell too far. Who were the watchers? Heaven's silent observers. Long before the flood, long before Babel, there were the watchers. Their name whispered through ancient texts like a shadow on stone. They were not demons. They were not rebels. Not yet. They were angels appointed by God's celestial scribes, sent not to interfere, but to observe. They stood between realms, watching the story of mankind unfold from behind the veil of heaven. Their presence was holy. Their purpose was pure. But even in heaven, the heart can wander. The word watcher comes from the root that means one who stays awake, one who never sleeps. They were never meant to speak, never meant to touch. They were the keepers of divine boundaries, a living witness that heaven was watching. But what happens when those who guard the line begin to long for what lies beyond it? The earth was growing. Civilization was rising like fire from dust. Beauty flourished, but so did corruption. And the watchers, once distant, grew restless. It began with a gaze, then with desire, then with a vow. One among them, Samyaza, spoke the words that would pierce eternity. "Let us descend and take wives for ourselves from among the daughters of men." He did not force them. He offered them an oath, a bond that none could break once spoken. And 200 angels, radiant in glory, bound themselves in a covenant of descent, not to fall, but to choose. And with that choice, the watchers stepped into history, not as guardians, but as intruders. They landed not in chaos, but in splendor. Their descent was not a crash, but a coronation. They came as gods, cloaked in beauty, draped in mystery. And the daughters of men received them, not with fear, but fascination. What followed was not just romance, it was the unraveling of divine order, because what they bore were not children. They were legends, giants, hybrids, the Nephilim, flesh made from rebellion, blood laced with glory and defiance. And the line between heaven and earth was no longer guarded. It was broken. What began as silent observation had become sacred violation. and the weight of what they would teach had not yet begun. The descent. When heaven touched earth without permission. The Watchers did not fall from grace like Lucifer. They stepped away from it. Their descent was not cast down, but chosen. A rebellion veiled in romance. A desire wrapped in devotion. But beneath it all was a hunger for authorship. They wanted to write the story of man, not merely record it. When their feet touched the earth, something shifted in the fabric of creation. The mountain they chose was Hermon, still whispered of in ancient tongues as cursed. There the oath was sealed. There the fracture between worlds began. They did not appear as monsters. They shone. They dazzled. Their glory intoxicated. And the women of earth received them unaware that this union would tear open the veil between flesh and spirit. From these unions came the Nephilim. Their name means the fallen ones, but it also means those who cause others to fall. They were not children. They were consequences. Born of divine DNA twisted by defiance, they carried not just strength, but domination. Their hunger was unearthly, their arrogance unmatched. They were the undoing of balance. But even more dangerous than their children were the secrets the Watchers brought with them. Forbidden knowledge, truths too holy for human hands. And what they shared would burn across generations, because the descent of the Watchers was not only a fall from heaven, it was a descent into the soul of mankind, a seed planted deep, a whisper that said, "You too can be like gods." But what did they teach? And why did God guard that knowledge from us in the first place? That is where the true danger begins. Not in what they were, but in what they gave us. Knowledge cloaked in light, but born from rebellion. And once it was shared, the world would never be the same. Forbidden knowledge, gifts that became curses. The Watchers came bearing gifts. But these were not blessings. They were revelations that broke the world. Secrets meant for heaven's throne were poured out upon the earth. And man, still clothed in dust and innocence, drank deeply, not knowing the cost. Azazel, one of their leaders, gave mankind the knowledge of metal. He taught them how to draw iron from the earth, to shape bronze into blades, to forge war from fire. Before him, man had tools of peace. After him, they had weapons of power. The soil once used for planting now ran red with blood. His teachings turned earth into battlefield, and brother against brother. What God formed for cultivation, Azazel converted into conquest. But he did not stop there. He unveiled the art of cosmetics, the dark seduction of appearance over essence. He taught how to darken the eyes, adorn the face shape, desire through illusion. Beauty became a weapon. Identity became a mask. Lust replaced love. And what once reflected God's image now mirrored vanity. Samyaza, their leader, taught enchantments, incantations, the summoning of spirits. He broke the veil between natural and supernatural. What was once sacred territory for prophets became common play for sorcerers. With every charm and whispered spell, man reached into realms he could not understand. And what reached back was not always light. Others taught astrology not to glorify the heavens, but to control fate. The stars no longer sang of God's order. They were turned into charts of ambition, calendars of conquest. The cosmos was no longer a canvas of wonder. It became a tool for manipulation. The heavens, which declared the glory of God, were now studied to declare the rise of kings and the fall of empires. These gifts were not evil by design, but they were devastating in hands unprepared. The knowledge given was not filtered through obedience nor offered through reverence. It was poured out in pride, in haste, in hunger. And it awakened something in humanity that God had held back for our protection. The power to rule, the power to kill, the power to twist the created order for self. Each forbidden teaching tore another thread from the fabric of Eden. And man, once walking with God, now walked in shadows, proud, armed, and deceived into thinking he had become more. But knowledge without surrender becomes a weapon. And these gifts, though radiant in their brilliance, came wrapped in the scent of death. The corruption of earth, when knowledge becomes poison. What the Watchers gave did not simply change the world. It infected it. Like ink spilled into water, their knowledge seeped into every corner of human life. But it did not bring light. It brought ruin. What began as sacred insight ended in spiritual disease. Humanity, once content in its dependence on God, now clung to the illusion of mastery. Men no longer prayed for rain. They sought to command the skies. They no longer looked to the Creator. They stared into stars, searching for answers in lights that could not speak. Enchantment replaced communion. Ritual replaced repentance. The divine became a game, and the soul became a battlefield. The Nephilim, the children of this unholy union, did more than dominate. They desecrated. Their appetite stretched beyond food. They devoured beast birds and men. They sinned against creation itself. They enslaved the weak. They taught men to kill for sport. They built cities not for sanctuary, but for spectacle. Blood was their currency, fear their inheritance. And humanity began to forget what it meant to be made in the image of God. Scripture echoes the aftermath. Genesis says, "The earth was corrupt in God's sight, filled with violence. Every thought of man's heart was only evil continually." This was not merely moral decline, it was spiritual decay. The world was unraveling from the inside out. The Watchers had not lifted mankind. They had buried him beneath the weight of divine knowledge, divorced from divine presence. The spiritual realm, once guarded, now bled into the earth. False gods rose, symbols of power etched into stone and skin. Nations began to rise on the backs of sorcery and bloodshed. The gods of Babylon, Egypt, Canaan all echo the gifts of the Watchers, twisted into religions of control. The poison was slow, but it was complete. Humanity was no longer simply lost. It was becoming something else, something unrecognizable. A creature that still bore God's breath but had forgotten his voice. And as the heavens looked down upon the world, they did not see ignorance. They saw arrogance, not weakness, but willful defiance. The knowledge had been planted, but what it grew was death. Heaven responds, divine judgment, through flood and fire. God does not judge in haste. He waits, he watches, he grieves. But there comes a moment when mercy, to remain mercy, must cleanse what has decayed beyond repair. And when heaven looked upon the earth, what it saw was no longer good. It was grotesque, twisted by forbidden knowledge, hollowed by pride, filled with violence that echoed from soil to sky. Genesis tells us that the Lord regretted making mankind, not because he failed, but because they had chosen to abandon what made them his. The sorrow of heaven turned into the movement of justice, and the Book of Enoch gives us a glimpse behind the veil, a moment when the divine court convened, a moment when God's silence broke not in words, but in command. He sent 4 archangels, not to comfort, but to confront. Michael the warrior, sent to strike at the Nephilim, to dismantle the power of the giants who ruled by fear and blood, His sword would silence the cries of the oppressed. Gabriel, the messenger, sent to bring death upon the offspring of rebellion, to end the bloodline of defiance, to remind the world that divine boundaries are not suggestions. Raphael the healer, but his mission was wrath. He was commanded to bind Azazel, the one who taught men to war and women to seduce. He dragged him into the desert of Dudael, a cursed land of burning stone and hollow silence. There Azazel was buried sealed until the day of final judgment, and Uriel, the light of God, sent not with wrath but with warning. He revealed the coming flood. He illuminated Noah, a single man in a sea of darkness, the last flicker of righteousness before the waters rose. The punishment of the watchers was not death. It was imprisonment. They were cast into the abyss. Not Sheol, not Hades, but Tartarus, a place beneath death itself, a prison where angels wait in chains of shadow groaning until the final day. Jude speaks of them still, bound in darkness, held for judgment. Then came the flood. The waters did not rage. They wept. They mourned for what had been lost, for what had been corrupted. It was not only a destruction, it was a reset, a mercy disguised as judgment, a divine act to preserve what was still holy before it was erased forever. Noah, a man blameless in his generation, was spared, not because he was perfect, but because he still walked with God. And through him, humanity would breathe again. But this time, the knowledge of the watchers would not rise with the waters. It would be buried, silenced, remembered only in whispers. But the question remained, why had God forbidden this knowledge in the first place? Was it fear, or was it love? And in that question lies the heart of the mystery, a truth deeper than the flood, quieter than judgment, a wisdom so sacred that only reverence can uncover it. Why was the knowledge forbidden? The wisdom behind the silence. God is not afraid of knowledge. He is its source. From his mouth come wisdom, understanding, and truth. But there is a difference between wisdom received in humility and power grasped in pride. The knowledge the watchers gave was not evil in essence. It was divine insight torn from its rightful place, ripped from heaven, and handed to earth by hands no longer clean. Why was it forbidden? Because knowledge without reverence becomes a mirror for pride. Because understanding without obedience becomes a doorway to rebellion. And because power without purpose becomes a weapon in the hands of the unprepared. From the very beginning, this was the pattern. In Eden, the serpent offered fruit not because it was forbidden, but because it promised independence. You shall be like God. That was the lie. Not the fruit itself, but the motive beneath the bite. And the watchers offered the same lie in a different form. You do not need to wait. You do not need to walk with him. You can rise without submission, ascend without permission, know without being taught. The Book of Enoch does not just record what was given, it reveals why it was taken. The watchers taught not out of love, but out of ambition. They gave not to glorify God, but to glorify themselves. And mankind hungry to become more drank what it could not digest. But God's boundaries are not barriers. They are safeguards. He does not hide truth to withhold. He withholds to prepare. A fire given to a child is not a gift. It is a curse. A blade placed in careless hands does not protect. It destroys. And this is the tragedy. The watchers offered shortcuts to divinity, and in taking them, mankind forfeited the process of becoming holy. We did not ascend. We fractured. We reached too soon and fell too far. This is why God silenced the knowledge. Not because we should never know, but because we were not ready to know. Not because we were unworthy, but because true worth is shaped through surrender, not conquest. In Proverbs it says, "Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall." The Watchers fell because they believed they could bypass God's design, and humanity fell with them, not in ignorance but in imitation. But even in judgment there was mercy. Even in silence there was wisdom. Because sometimes what God does not say is just as holy as what He does. And sometimes the greatest protection is unanswered questions. Yet even now, long after the flood, the ripple of their influence moves through time. Because while the angels are bound, their shadow still walks among us, not in fire, but in thought, not in form, but in ambition. And the question remains, if the knowledge was forbidden, then what happens when we pursue it now? Echoes in the modern world, are we repeating the pattern? The Watchers were cast down, their bodies bound beneath the earth, their voices silenced by divine judgment. But the hunger they awakened in humanity was never buried. It lingers, it breathes, it evolves, and today it wears new names. We live in an age flooded with knowledge, yet parched of wisdom. We split atoms, we edit genes, we teach machines to think and call it progress. But behind every discovery lies an ancient echo, a whisper from a time when angels once gave forbidden gifts. We build weapons that can erase nations. We shape life in laboratories. We scan the stars not to wonder, but to conquer. And in it all the same, hunger rises. To ascend without God, to master what was never ours to hold. The Book of Enoch speaks of astrology turned into control. Today we look not to stars, but to data. Algorithms predict our desires before we speak them. Influence becomes the new sorcery. Image becomes the new idol. And the world once filled with prayer and awe now bends towards self. Ancient occult symbols resurface as trends. Enchantments repackaged as spiritual wellness. Crystal spellwork and hidden knowledge offered to the curious. Not as evil, but as empowerment. But the source is the same. The shadow of the Watchers rising again in a digital world. Jesus warned us, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be at the coming of the Son of Man. He wasn't only speaking of violence, he was speaking of transgression, of a world that crosses sacred lines in the name of advancement, of a people who once again forget the holiness of dependence. And now we chase the same fire. We reach for knowledge to become gods, not to serve, but to rule, not to love, but to dominate. And the veil thins once more. The angels may be chained, but the lie they told is still loosed. And until we see that our greatest danger is not what we build, but why we build it, we will continue the fall they began. And as we stand in this age of mirrors and machines, one truth returns with haunting clarity. The story of the Watchers is not only ancient, it is unfolding still, not in myth, but in the motives of our hearts. And the final choice, like their first descent, waits at the edge of every soul. The story of the Watchers is not simply a tale of ancient angels and divine judgment. It is a mirror held up to every age that has dared to reach for knowledge without wisdom, power without purpose, and glory without God. It reminds us that the greatest spiritual danger is not ignorance but arrogance, not what we do not know, but what we believe we can control without reverence. The Book of Enoch was not cast aside because it lacked truth. It was silenced because it revealed too much of it. It pulls back the veil on a sacred boundary that humanity has always longed to cross. But what lies on the other side is not always light. Sometimes it is a flood. Sometimes it is silence. Sometimes it is the aching realization that not all knowledge is a blessing. Yet in the midst of that silence, God speaks, not always in answers, but in invitation. An invitation to walk with him as Enoch did, quietly, faithfully, with a humility that does not demand every mystery be explained, but trusts that some truths are meant to be carried, not conquered. The story is not over. The watchers are bound, but the question they left behind still speaks. Who will you become when power is within reach? Will you pursue the fruit or the Father, the secret or the source? Because in the end, truth is not a possession. It is a person. If this journey opened your eyes to forgotten truths or stirred your spirit to reflect more deeply, we invite you to like this video, share it with someone who hungers for meaning, and subscribe to support more sacred investigations into the mysteries of Scripture. Share your thoughts below. What do you believe the story of the Watchers means for us today? Let your voice join the conversation, because what was buried is rising, and what was silenced must be heard again.